It is no secret that South Africans feel battered by stories of corruption, organized crime, greed, and that powerful people continue to be implicated. It might be surprising then that in other parts of the world, South Africa is celebrated for its efforts. In this series of conversations, we focus on the other side. We want to move beyond headlines and hear from people at the coalface of efforts to deal with corruption and organized crime. I'm Cheryl Frank. I run the Anti-Corruption and Accountability Project at the Institute for Security Studies. So we're speaking to Martin Schönteich today. Martin is a specialist on prosecutions and criminal justice, and he's done research on this issue in South Africa and around the world. We're very pleased to have you with us, Martin. Thank you for spending this time with us. Martin is a colleague at the Institute for Security Studies. So Martin, firstly, tell us about your professional journey and how you came to work on matters relating to prosecutions.
Yes, no, thank you for having me. It's been my career kind of come full circle in the sense that I started my career as a prosecutor in Durban, South Africa. I was a young man and joined the prosecution service just around the time of the political transition. So it was fascinating in that sense. Obviously, I didn't have an influence on policy. I did minor cases, but I had a kind of a ringside seat to how a prosecution service was beginning to reform itself to accommodate a new constitution, new laws, new regulations, and so forth. And it instilled in me a kind of a sense of interest in policy making. And as a result of that, I then moved to the Institute for Security Studies, an applied research institute that works in Africa on human security issues. And I focused on criminal justice, rule of law related issues. And then moved from there to a very similar role, but more international, working for a big global NGO based in New York, but they had offices around the world, primarily supporting their work on criminal justice reform and rule of law reform, in a very technical, hands-on sense.
So let's just talk about the rule of law then. You know, it's a concept that gets thrown around a lot. What do we mean when we speak about the rule of law? And why is it important to understand what that concept means as we talk about criminal justice and prosecutions?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, at its most basic, the rule of law really means that that everybody is subject to and accountable to the law, whether one is the president of the country or the monarch or an average person or even a homeless, marginalized person. Those laws should be fair, they should be independently adjudicated. They should be known, so people shouldn't be surprised about which laws they might offend against. So that sounds quite technical, but it actually has a lot of repercussions on the well-being of society, whether there is a rule of law. There's a lot of data now available that shows where the rule of law is weak. There's less investment, there's less business confidence, there's more crime, there's more violence. And we've seen this in South Africa. So in terms of international rankings, South Africa has declined in terms of its rule of law, well-being or score. And I think the consequences of that are not only grand corruption, which powerful people believe that they are invulnerable and can act in it with impunity, but even more kind of normal people, if I could put it like that, are beginning to take the laws into their own hands because they have no trust and faith in the criminal justice system. And one sees that with the increase in vigilantism and with mob justice, which often results in violence and murder and so forth. And all of that, of course, over time undermines people's faith in democracy itself, which of course has long-term repercussions for the well-being of any society.
That's a helpful start. So as we begin to talk about corruption then, and particularly our criminal justice system as it relates to dealing with that problem, maybe just map out for us the key institutions that are South African institutions that are intended to respond to corruption.
So there are quite a number of institutions, and this is why this is such a complex area in many ways to really combat corruption in a sustained manner. So one could argue, one could begin in respect of institutions that have a role to play to alert law enforcement of potential corruption, and ideally even to try and prevent major corruption before it even occurs.
Right.
So those would be intelligence agencies, such as police intelligence, for example. But also would be the financial institutions, if they see suspicious transactions happening, for example, or people opening bank accounts under different names. Corruption might not yet have happened, but if they have that capability of picking up on those actions, they could already alert law enforcement to keep a closer eye on what's happening.
Right.
But if one then moves to the formal criminal justice system, then of course, once corruption has already happened, and of course ideally one would want to prevent that, but if it has already happened, then the police is the first major agency that has a role to play. They would investigate, they would interview witnesses, they would collect evidence, and then hand it over to the next stage of that criminal justice process, the prosecutions or the prosecution service. And they have the role or the responsibility to use all that information that the police is able to gather and convert it in a way in which it can be presented in court. So the evidence has to be collected in an admissible way, in a correct way. Witnesses have to be prepared to give evidence in court, to give the courts enough information and insight to potentially convict persons of a criminal offense. And the burden is very high on the prosecution. They have to persuade the court that people are guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So it's a fairly high bar. So the prosecution is the second kind of major element of the criminal justice process. Then, of course, the courts who do the adjudication, and the defense bar, because people need to be defended, of course, as well. Two other very important role players. The defense in terms of making sure that people get a fair trial, they're properly represented, and to make sure that only the guilty are likely to be convicted. The courts to listen to the evidence, and if they do convict, to give a fair and appropriate sentence. And then even beyond that, one could argue, even after conviction and sentencing, one could say that the prison system or the correctional services system has a role to play in respect of those who are incarcerated, that they are rehabilitated. Eventually these people will be released again, that they return to society as law-abiding citizens. So it's a long, drawn-out process with many different agencies, and each of them works only as well as the weakest link in this long, drawn-out chain of agencies.
Yeah, and then there are parallel agencies like the SIU.
Indeed. So in addition to that, to add another layer of complexity, there are other agencies or entities that also investigate. SIU most certainly, and they do investigate and report matters to the prosecution service to allow them to take on that matter to prosecute. There could be other private sector agencies that might do their own internal investigations in terms of corruption or fraud that might go on. They would hand over that material to the police or to the prosecution. So there are many sources or avenues of supply of evidence of wrongdoing.
Right.
And the police and the prosecution then has to filter through that and decide which matters to then actually pursue to trial.
And those might be just information about wrongdoing or intelligence about wrongdoing that must be translated into evidence through a process.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very important point to make.
Yes.
And it's often, I think it creates some public confusion and even unhappiness because from the point of view of the public, they read about somebody, an official say, who's done something wrong, allegedly, in the media or even in a formal commission of inquiry. But that's simply information which has been presented to a journalist, to this commission, or whatever the case might be. It hasn't been tested in a court of law. The information hasn't been collected in a legally intricate way. So in other words, that information still has to be converted to admissible evidence, where one can follow the chain of evidence. So for example, if one submits an electronic file or a written document, the prosecution would have to show and convince the court that that information has not been tampered with between those who first wrote it up or wrote or typed something into a computer up to the point where it's actually handed over to the court. That sounds quite simple, but there are a lot of different technical stages that have to be followed to make sure that that information is admissible. If it's not, the defense is likely to contest it. And at best, it'll delay matters, but at worst, it'll destroy the strength of the trial from the prosecution's point of view.
Yeah, and we're going to come back to that. But just to divert a little bit to commissions of inquiry, because we've talked about that a little bit now, is what status do they have in terms of criminal justice processes then?
They have some powers of criminal justice agencies. They can subpoena people, they can subpoena materials and documentation. People are questioned in a very formal way at these commissions of inquiry. They can even be placed under oath. So it is more than just information one would read in the media. It does carry more weight than that. But it still doesn't carry the weight of evidence which can just be used as it's given to the commission in a court of law. Much more work needs to be done to use that publicly available information from the commissions to have it in a way which is admissible from a kind of technical legal point of view.
Yeah.
And it's frustrating because often there is a lot of potentially incriminating information which is available to the commissions and as a result of that to the public as well.
Yeah.
And then the public, of course, despairs because it takes a long time for the prosecution to properly digest that information and to present it in court. And it's partly because, certainly in South Africa's case, there is just so much wrongdoing that the volume of information that is potentially available literally goes into the hundreds of thousands of pages. And it takes a long time for any prosecutor or teams of prosecutors to properly interrogate that.
So, Martin, the State Capture Commission, the Zondo Commission of Inquiry, as we call it, brought to light dramatic stories of grand corruption in South Africa. And obviously, we're still digesting that. Those have been brought to light and been investigated and prosecuted. Historically, many other countries have gone through this sort of trauma of exposure of grand corruption and the levels of grand corruption that we observed that the Commission brought to light. So tell us a little bit more about what you've seen through your research, and are there common factors across these countries that contribute to vulnerabilities to grand corruption?
So the short answer is yes to both those questions. It's in a way a sobering story what's happening around the world. I've come across many jurisdictions and countries where grand corruption or state capture, as we call it in South Africa, has played quite a significant role in undermining the well-being of those societies. You have networks of elite politicians who use people or allies in the private sector and associated networks to really capture elements of the state, typically law enforcement agencies, but also other agencies, to try and extract public resources. This is not uncommon. One has it in many countries. South Africa might err on the side of being fairly extreme in that regard because the amounts of money that were siphoned off during the period of state capture were really quite significant in relation to South Africa's GDP. But where South Africa maybe also stands out is in the openness in which this wrongdoing has been revealed through the State Capture Commission to vibrant media, which is not the case in all the countries which I looked at. But to get to your second question, are there any commonalities as to what brings this about?
But before you get to that, Martin, tell us a little bit about the countries that you've studied and where you've observed similar levels of grand corruption, similar kinds of grand corruption.
So one set of countries where it really struck me was in the former Soviet Union. What would now be Russia and countries in far Eastern Europe and Central Asia, where during a period of transition, actually parallels with South Africa, we had a change in government, in political and economic elites, used that transitionary period when laws were a bit uncertain, when the infrastructure of the state was being reorganized and hence was also weakened as a result of that, used those weaknesses and opportunities to take over parts of the state for their own gain. So the former Soviet Union, certainly as a bloc, one could say, was a very rich environment in which where grand corruption occurred, and one could argue it still occurs in some of those countries in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Then I would say in parts of Southeastern Europe, in the Balkans, also part of the Soviet orbit, also after the transition, when the state was weakened, people were uncertain about new laws that were about to be passed. And in that chaos, clever and astute business people and politicians colluded to extract wealth. And then the other part of the world where I've seen it is parts of Latin America. Mexico, Brazil, Peru, these are all places which come to mind, where either broadly in those countries or in certain regions, because some of these countries are very large and federal entities, regional corrupt politicians have taken over or occupied the state, captured the state to extract wealth and rent from public resources.
So Martin, speak a little bit more to the vulnerabilities then. You know, the commonalities, you talked about transition, uncertainties of legal regimes through transition, uncertainty, I suppose, of enforcement during those times. A little bit more about what's common across those countries.
I think a second aspect which is quite common is that one normally is dealing with a very entrenched political bloc. So in South Africa's case, even though it became a democracy, in many ways a vibrant democracy after 1994, in effect it was a one-party dominant democracy. You had the same party in power for almost 30 years. It's only in the last 2 years or so that there's a multi-party government. And that seems to be a similar pattern in many of the other countries which have also suffered from grand corruption and state capture. You had the same ruling elite in power, who eventually were able to use the influence to put the right people into key positions in the civil service, in the public service, in other key institutions which were supposed to oversee government and thereby capture those government institutions. I think that's one important factor. A second one is a weakness in oversight institutions.
Right.
So in many cases, the legislature, parliament, was either co-opted by a very powerful, domineering executive. One could argue to a certain extent that was the case in South Africa. But also many other places where parliament or the legislature or other oversight institutions, that could be the prosecution service, the police or financial agencies which are supposed to oversee government, were either weakened or never strong enough after the transition period to properly hold people in power to account. Those, I would say, are probably those three: the transition, and the uncertainty around the transition, a very strong executive, which is there for a longer period of time and can begin to occupy the space of the public service, and weak oversight institutions, especially around parliament, I would say are driving factors or characteristics of successful grand corruption around the world.
And so what we see now, and maybe it's a good lead into a discussion around the organization of corruption, maybe, and we see an emergence of organized crime in South Africa. A lot more conversation about organized crime. The Madlanga Commission sitting currently is looking into the organization of the questions around the organization of criminality, even within criminal justice agencies, and questions about whether they're complicit in organized crime. So, I mean, how common is this factor in the levels of grand corruption you've seen elsewhere? And the implication, is this problem with us to stay, or can countries move beyond this in terms of, let's just speak about in criminal justice agencies first.
So it's unfortunately very common. And I think it's for the reason that for organized crime or grand corruption to be really successful, collusion by at least parts of the criminal justice system or apparatus are necessary. They might not always be sufficient, but without it, organized crime and grand corruption can't flourish. And so that's almost a given, I would say, universally around the world. And that even goes to fairly low-level organized crime syndicates and gangs. There's typically always a corrupt police officer or more involved. There's always corrupt lawyers and professional enablers involved. So that's very typical what we're seeing in South Africa. What's worrying in South Africa's case is that it seems to be reaching into very high levels of the criminal justice apparatus. We're not talking about uniformed police, or not only about uniformed police, or mid-ranking officials, but very senior political appointees. And what I've learned through some comparative research is that once organized crime and grand corruption gets really entrenched, it's very difficult to push back because the institutions of the state themselves have become corrupt. It's not impossible, but it's really a long-term endeavor which requires tremendous political will, which many governments often don't have over the longer term. It requires the the revitalization and repair and fixing of criminal justice institutions. Again, it's not impossible, but it's a very difficult and drawn-out process. It's always much easier to undermine and destroy than it is to repair and to fix.
Yeah.
And that's going to be South Africa's challenge. I think South Africa, because of a vibrant media, because of largely independent courts, there's a lot of knowledge about what is going on, about the state, the level of corruption, who is being implicated. At least on the face of it, there might arguably be even more. But there is a lot of knowledge. The question is how does one then now fight back? And that has to be an all-of-society approach. Obviously, on the side of the executive and the politicians, there has to be the will and the stamina to do it. Yeah. But they have to be supported by civil society organizations, by the public more broadly. Yeah. And that's also, I think, something which has come out of my international experiences. That very often the kind of the tipping point comes when civil society is prepared to go out onto the streets and fight for their rights and fight back. That sort of gives politicians a bit of courage and undermines kind of the self-confidence or the arrogance of those who are corrupting and capturing the state.
Yeah. So, Martin, we want to speak a little bit about, following from the Zondo Commission, all these revelations of corruption and corruption in government, in business, amongst the political class in South Africa. And South Africans have been so frustrated by the pace of progress when it comes to holding people accountable for their behavior. And, people want to see people, suspects in orange overalls. We want to see people convicted. So the pace of progress in terms of investigations and prosecutions, is that a common phenomenon? What have you seen in other places in terms of how long it takes to bring people to account for these sorts of crimes?
So the frustration is, I think, completely understandable, especially in the South African case where state capture not only siphoned off such enormous amount of money and wealth from the public coffer, but undermined the institutions of state themselves. So while one can understand those frustrations, I think it is important to make the point that speaking comparatively, looking at other countries who also went through similar state capture periods or high-level corruption, typically these kinds of investigations against very influential and senior people and prosecutions do take a very long time. A very timely example would be the case of the previous president of France, Nicolas Sarkozy, who only a few weeks ago, in I think September, October 2025, was actually physically transported to prison because of something of corrupt and fraudulent activities he had engaged in some 20 years previously, in the mid-2000s, 2005, 2006. Yeah. And he just managed through continuous appeals and interlocutory proceedings and finding technical difficulties in the prosecution's case, managed to drag out that prosecution over a very long period of time. And I think that's maybe one of the more extreme cases, and South Africa maybe falls a bit on that side. The Zuma investigation and prosecution has also been some 20 years, but periods of 5 to 10 years are not unusual at all. What makes it also, I think, more complex in South Africa's case is that while our criminal justice system is busy investigating and prosecuting these state capture suspects who are accused, they of course also have to deal with general crime. And there South Africa really does stand out. The levels of serious, violent, general crime in South Africa are extraordinarily high. Murder would be a good example. South Africa has almost 30,000 murders a year. It's about 8 times as many murders as occur in the whole of the European Union and the 27 member states of the EU. So the burden which is placed on the individual detective or prosecutor just dealing with general crime is enormous. So then to find the space and the capacity and resources to deal with what are often very complex and drawn out investigations and prosecutions is really difficult and implies some difficult choices prosecutors and investigators have to make as to what to focus on and what to prioritize on. Maybe also to make the point, and this is one of the reasons you asked me, why are these matters taking so long to investigate and prosecute? These are not run-of-the-mill fraud or corruption cases. These are people who have engaged in corrupt and fraudulent activities over many years, involving multiple institutions and individuals, and often also in multiple jurisdictions.
Right.
So to investigate those matters properly requires teams of detectives and prosecutors working with counterparts in other jurisdictions, which in itself is complicated, has to go through very technical procedures and processes, and requires often very specialist skills, people who can understand complex financial statements, who can withdraw or extract large reams of digital information and data and make sense of that. And all of the things, if one wants to do it properly, which the state has to do if they want to convince a court to convict somebody beyond a reasonable doubt, does take months and typically many years to do effectively.
But do you get a sense, though, that our criminal justice system is up to that task? And what would be the range of limitations that those challenges that we have to maneuver in order to strengthen the ability of our system to respond to those crimes?
Yes. So I think our criminal justice system in South Africa is somewhat overwhelmed just by the volume of matters they are expected to deal with. Not only because state capture happened over a long period of time, and that in itself entails a lot of suspects and accused and a lot of potential prosecutions, but also because of the high level of general crime, which South Africans understandably also want to be dealt with. Murders and armed robberies and sexual offences, those are all serious, important matters that have to be dealt with as well. And South Africa is a middle-income country, so there are a limited number of prosecutors and detectives. And even those are often paid at levels which this private sector can offer much more. So it's often difficult for the prosecution and the police to compete with skilled private sector personnel, especially when it comes to more intricate and complex financial crimes and financial matters, where the private sector has a high demand as well. So that's certainly one challenge. And the other challenge that one has in South Africa, although it's not unique, but maybe a bit accentuated in South Africa, is the difficulty of real effective collaboration between the different core elements of the criminal justice system. South Africa is a common law system, so the police and the detective side of things are quite separate from the prosecution. They do the investigations. Once those have been done, it's handed over to the prosecution, and they then proceed with that matter, ideally to trial. But that kind of overlap, or that connection between investigation and prosecution is a real weakness. It's less so in civil law countries, as one has in Europe, for example, where often prosecutors have their own detectives they can work with. That's generally not the case in South Africa, with some exceptions, such as investigating directorate. But that's certainly, I think, a weakness one has in South Africa as well. And then, of course, the glaring kind of weakness is the period of state capture, where for a period of almost a decade, very consciously, the core elements of the criminal justice system were weakened and undermined. Good people were driven out or resigned or left. Systems were damaged or undermined. And the prosecution service and the police are still working to repair those broken systems. And while at the same time trying to deal with many state capture matters and general crime as well. And to do all of those things at once is very difficult and just takes very long.
But we're certainly seeing some positive moves in terms of a lot of cases being in court, a lot of suspects being in court, most notably in the Transnet case. So, and that you would say is a result of specialization in terms of commercial crimes, prosecutors and investigators being enabled to do their work. And you mentioned the investigating directorate against corruption. So maybe speak about how you think that specialization helps.
So specialization is crucial when it comes to organized crime, complex corruption, state capture, all those kinds of crime phenomena can only really effectively be dealt with by the state if there's specialization. You need dedicated investigators and prosecutors who understand their field, not only academically and theoretically, but have actually done that kind of work for many years, who are experienced in their craft of investigations and prosecutions. And in many ways, the NPA, the prosecution service, is being quite good in that respect, in terms of the way it organizes itself. It has a lot of specialized units and entities within the NPA. The challenge remains one of capacity. They're not enough. It's purely a numbers game, given the volume of crime. So there are not enough specialized investigators and prosecutors. And often, sometimes, the really intricate or sophisticated high-level skills are in short supply. Right. Partly because the resources are not available within the state, and because the private sector can offer much better salaries. Yeah. So even though there might be some really skilled prosecutors and investigators, quite a number of them don't stay for long enough to really build on and entrench their expertise within the state apparatus, but move over to the private sector where the conditions of service are better and more tempting.
Yeah. So the complexity of these investigations and prosecutions really is a driver to this, the fact that the pace of these investigations, the complexity, and then the specialized capabilities required in terms of digital digital capabilities and the ability to analyze, use large amounts of information, financial information. The international nature of some of these cases, I would imagine. So I'm interested in also another phenomenon that keeps getting spoken about, which is these Stalingrad tactics. And speaker, you started talking a little bit about it in the Sarkozy case of delaying tactics used by criminal defense. In criminal defense tactics. Could you just speak a little bit about the origin of that term firstly, and then how that plays out in our courts?
Yes. So in many ways it's become quite a South African term in the context of the criminal justice system. Of course, its origins come from the Second World War, where the German forces were trying to take over Stalingrad, a city in Russia. And the strategy of their Russian counterparts was to defend the city vigorously, literally street by street, house by house, eventually wearing down and tiring out the enemy. And as a result, they won. The Germans had to retreat. And that, in many ways, it's become shorthand now for what's happening in South Africa in our courts, where people use delaying tactics and methods of frustrating the criminal justice process by making all kinds of interlocutory requests and proceedings, contesting everything possible that the state tries to show to the court or to get the court to move on, to try and delay the process of the trial. Right. And we've seen it, I think, very clearly in the Jacob Zuma prosecution, where matters such banal as, arrest warrants have been contested, the legality of arrest warrants, the legality of the prosecution team. There have been applications to get the prosecutor removed. There have been applications to get legal aid applied in those cases. So very technical issues, but each of those applications are not only in themselves delaying, but they're typically then also appealed to a higher court. And as a result, for each of those applications, there's a year or two which is lost. Yes. And of course, the longer the time passes, the more vulnerable the witnesses then become. Some might even die, and others might forget exactly what they witnessed some 20, 30 years ago, or just lose interest in the matter. So there's some strategy behind it. But one can also argue that, and I think the NPA is making increasingly an effort around that regard, to try and be more forceful, to try and counter these kinds of frustrating tactics by well-resourced accused and defendants. Yeah.
So I think it really is a balance between protecting the rights of accused people in the legal process and then ensuring that justice is administered, right? And how is that? I mean, where are the points where we could improve that? Is it the judiciary asserting more control over the process and managing that process better? Where is the sticking point that we can facilitate faster trials?
Yes. I mean, some suggestions would be more technical. So sometimes one gets a sense that where the NPA, the prosecution service, is pursuing a high-profile individual, they do it almost too thoroughly in the sense that they proceed with all the possible charges they can against that accused. And these are people who've obviously committed offences or alleged offences over a long period of time, so the number of charges can run into the hundreds, each of them involving endless piles of documents and witnesses and material. And often it might make sense to take a step back and say, well, maybe we should just focus on a dozen key charges, which will be just as effective in terms of the sentence that will eventually be imposed if the person is convicted, rather than trying to pursue everything. It's difficult, I think, often for a prosecutor to do that. It's not in their nature. If they find wrongdoing and there's a reasonable prospect of conviction, they pursue it. But for tactical reasons, it might be wiser to focus in. I think another way to try and address this is through building the skills of specialist prosecutors in the NPA and specialist detectives as well. There are at the moment just a handful of prosecutors who've really got a lot of experience in countering Stalingrad tactics, because it's relatively new to South Africa. And some of it is still also new law, which is still being developed. Our constitution is just around 30 years old, which introduced a lot of rights to protect defendants, given South Africa's history. So it's understandable that it is a difficult topic or area in which to operate. But as prosecutors become more confident and develop more skills, I think they will be able to fight back more effectively. And then it's also to draw in skills which are not typically found in the police or in the prosecution service, because in many of these cases you need accountants, data analysts, financial analysts, which are relatively plentiful in the private sector, but not in the criminal justice system. And I think the state has to become a bit more nimble and a bit more flexible in bringing in those skills, either through contracts or secondments, whatever the case might be, to make use of those skills where they're not available. Of course, ideally, that should be nurtured within the state apparatus, but that's going to take 10 or 15 years, and I think South Africa doesn't have neither the patience nor the time to do that.
We've seen business initiatives to strengthen that particular issue, which is digital forensics and bringing in that capability to support the NPA's prosecutions. Could you tell us a little bit about what you know about that?
South Africa, in this sense, is actually being quite innovative. It really stands out, I would say, compared to many of the countries in which I worked. The level and the depth of public-private collaboration or partnerships when it comes to criminal justice. And this is from fairly run-of-the-mill activities, business against crime, putting up CCTV cameras, developing business improvement districts, to a burgeoning and growing private security industry, to very high-level initiatives where big business or the corporate sector is working collaboratively and in a committed way over a number of years to assist the government to strengthen some government capacities, not only in criminal justice, it's in the energy sector as well and transport, but certainly in the criminal justice sector. And to the extent that the private sector can use some of the skills that are available to it, managerial skills, technical skills, and transfer those or benefit the state with those in a collaborative environment without undermining, obviously, the sovereignty of the state and state institutions. I think this is a very interesting and positive development. One has to be careful, obviously. The prosecution still has to make a decision as to who to prosecute. This has to be done fairly in terms of constitutional principles. But the kind of technical assistance and managerial and project management assistance, where the private sector traditionally is strong, I think could serve the state very well when it comes to criminal justice reform and effectiveness.
So the other element that we're seeing an alarming increase in is threats to the safety of witnesses, whistleblowers, criminal justice officials themselves. We've seen assassinations in recent years, certainly in the recent weeks. Can we expect more of this as the system gets better at prosecuting corruption, organized crime? How do we address these matters of safety?
So before I get to your question, I think it's worthwhile just to sketch the background in the sense that assassinations have become very widespread in South Africa. There's an international NGO, that the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, that keeps a database of assassinations, including in South Africa. And since the turn of the century, there have been over 2,000 in South Africa. They're very high in number. Not all of them are whistleblowers or witnesses by any means. There are a lot of political assassinations as well. But nevertheless, the number is high. And of course, that creates its own climate of fear within society more generally, and has a sobering effect on potential witnesses and whistleblowers and ever coming forward. So it is certainly very worrying, and I think if that cannot be turned around, it will become increasingly difficult for the state to hope that whistleblowers and witnesses will come forward. Now, the bad news is that it does seem, if one looks at other jurisdictions, the more the state begins to focus on high-level organized crime syndicates and organizations, the worse the position becomes, at least initially, for whistleblowers and witnesses. There's a very visceral or aggressive reaction by organized criminals. They have a very entrenched interest in maintaining the corrupt arrangements that they have. So they fight back quite vigorously. And it's not only in South Africa or developing countries. There was a time in Italy, for example, where judges and magistrates and prosecutors were not just assassinated, but literally blown up in car bombs and other killings. So it will tend to get worse before it gets better. But that shouldn't discourage one. If one doesn't want to become a failed state, one has to overcome that hurdle and fight back vigorously enough through witness protection programs, through targeting those who one suspects are behind the assassinations, to turn the page or turn the corner, as it were. As through changes in legislation, the many ways, many things South Africa can do to try and protect and promote whistleblowing and witnesses in these complex and dangerous matters.
So Martin, I think the complexity of the legal system and process speaks to us needing to be a lot more strategic in our investigations and prosecutions. We have the emergence of some new ideas and approaches, such as corporate alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, at least to deal with corruption cases. So tell us a little bit more about that approach.
So the corporate alternative dispute resolution mechanisms, or corporate ADRMs, is still a fairly new field, but a growing field internationally. Quite a number of developed criminal justice systems have incorporated this into their toolbox to fight corruption, especially complex corruption. And it's really a way to give prosecutors the option not to prosecute, but to develop an alternative. It's called a non-prosecution agreement or deferred prosecution agreement. In other countries or jurisdictions, in South Africa, it's corporate ADRMs. It's powerful in the sense that it extracts quite a bit from the wrongdoing corporation or private sector company. They have to admit the wrongdoing. They typically would have to pay a penalty or a fine. They have to return their illicit gains. They have to agree to collaborate with further investigations or prosecutions against individuals in those corporations, because corporate ADRMs are only in relation to corporations, not corrupt individuals. Right. And very often those corporations also have to put into place remedial mechanisms internally to try and prevent future wrongdoing. And if those are properly supervised by the prosecution or by the state, this can be very effective to try and prevent further corruption or wrongdoing by the companies. The benefit is that it avoids the prosecution having to go through what are often very expensive and drawn-out trials. Where often maybe the resolution thereof is uncertain. It might even result in an acquittal, for example. So
and specifically with offenders that have deep pockets, like corporates.
Of course, who would engage in Stalingrad type tactics, who will draw out proceedings and cost the state a lot of resources and money. So it's a kind of a shortcut. And I think one needs to emphasize, because there has been some misunderstanding, it's really directed at the corporations, as I say. Individual wrongdoers and offenders are still liable to be prosecuted. In fact, arguably more effectively, because those corporations, as part of their agreement with the state not to be prosecuted, commit to collaborating in investigations in respect of their employees or ex-employees who might have committed offences.
So Martin, we've talked a lot about the prioritization of prosecutions. So maybe just speak about this particular approach in investigating and prosecuting organized crime and corruption.
So maybe just to make the first contextual point that there are always going to be too many crimes for a prosecution service to prosecute. This is not unique to South Africa. It's globally the case, maybe especially so in South Africa, given the high volume of serious crimes. So it stands to reason that there has to be choices. There have to be choices and prioritization of certain forms of crime. In respect of organized crime, it stands to reason because organized crime is a very kind of broad, diverse field as a crime phenomena. And different organized criminal groups do different levels or intensity of damage to the well-being of society. So of course, ideally one would want to prosecute them all, but the focus should be, if one has to choose, to focus on those groups which undermine the well-being of society to the greatest extent. And then within those groups, focus in on individuals which are the leaders, the kingpins, as it were, within those syndicates. So that, in other words, fewer targeted but strategic prosecutions can disproportionately damage and neutralize criminal groups and organized crime groups if they're targeted in that manner. The problem in South Africa is that it also should spill over to general prosecutions, given the high volume of crime. So we know from victimization surveys, there are about 4.5 million crimes which are committed every year in South Africa. Only about half of those, about 2 million, are eventually recorded by the police. Half of those, in turn, are then transferred to the prosecution service where there's more or less sufficient evidence to prosecute. But the actual matters that go to trial and result in a conviction are only about a fifth of those, about 200,000 of the initial 4.5 million crimes result in a conviction. So the funnel is quite extreme. So in other words, the NPA has to, taking something to trial is a very important decision, using very precious prosecutorial resources. And those choices have to be taken in a very considerate way. And that's where prioritization plays such an important role, to make sure the prioritization takes place in a transparent and coherent and rational manner.
Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the strategies that could be employed to focus prosecutions. Some sort of safety valves like corporate ADRMs where you can hive off certain cases into different ways of resolution. I want to just focus on the prosecution service itself, our National Prosecuting Authority. Given it's a relatively small institution, maybe you can just give us a sense of its size in relation to our policing service and our detective services. And then some of the core problems that face the institution and in your, at a very high level, some of the strategies we need to employ to protect that institution going forward in terms of its key functions.
So the National Prosecuting Authority is a relatively small organization. It employs about 6,000 people, of which about 4,000 or so are actual prosecutors who prosecute matters in court. But it's also in the context of South Africa's sheer size that demonstrate how relatively small that entity is. South Africa is geographically very large. It's more or less the size of Western Europe. It's got 62 million people and these massive volumes of crime. And then you have about 4,500 prosecutors who have to deal with it. And of course, they have to work very closely with the police. There's some 200,000 or so police officers in South Africa who generate, understandably so, and importantly so, a lot of work for prosecutors. They investigate crimes, they take statements, they develop dockets, all of which eventually funnels through to the prosecution service to either decide to prosecute or to decline. And where they proceed, then it's a long drawn-out process to make sure that there's a trial-ready matter, that witnesses are prepared, there's sufficient evidence to take the matter to trial. The NPA is, of course, challenged in the sense, one, that it sits in the middle of the criminal justice process. So it can only be as good as, on the one hand, the police and the investigation is in taking matters to the investigative stage where they hand it over to the prosecution. And on the other hand, on the other side of the criminal justice chain, how effective the courts are. So we know from annual data that the courts typically only sit some 2 or 3 hours a day. And there are whole complex reasons for that. But it just goes to show that trial time or court time is a very limited and precious resource for the NPA. So they're very limited in terms of the number of trials and prosecutions they can do by the number of courtrooms, how long those courtrooms operate and sit and so forth. So this kind of central position of the NPA increases the challenging role it plays, navigating both making sure the investigations are properly done and that the courts are sufficiently receptive of the cases that it takes before them. On a more structural or strategic level, the NPA suffers from the weakness that it's not completely independent in a factual sense from the executive. The Constitution grants it that kind of theoretical independence. Prosecutors are supposed to prosecute without fear, favor, and prejudice. Prosecutorial independence as a concept is constitutionally and legislatively enshrined. But for day-to-day operations, about making hiring decisions, about changing human resource policies and strategies, in terms of its finances, a budget that is given to the NPA, it's still very much reliant on the Department of Justice. And while that does not necessarily, although it has in the past, not necessarily undermine prosecutorial decisions, but that is a risk I think one should be aware of, it does create bottlenecks and weaknesses in the operational efficiency of the NPA. And that's something that will need to be addressed. And I think Parliament has spoken about it. Indeed, even the executive has spoken about it as something that should happen. So has the Zondo Commission and civil society. It's now a question of making sure that the NPA Act is amended and that changes are made to the law to give the NPA both operational and financial independence in addition to the independence it already enjoys in making prosecutorial decisions. The other challenge the NPA will have to address, and we've spoken about this already, is to make sure that its specialization proceeds apace, that it increasingly develops a specialized capacity when it comes to complex matters, from organized crime to complex corruption to cybercrime and so forth. But that it also develops a mechanism in terms of cultivating that human potential in the organization, to recruit the right people, to make sure those people stay on, so that they share their insights and resources and knowledge with the organization over the longer term. So that requires a rethinking of recruitment strategies, of hiring strategies, and professional development and skills development strategies within the NPA. Some of this is already happening, which is quite innovative, but more work needs to be done.
Thank you, Martin. So as we close this discussion, I'm interested in your thoughts about the role of civil society. You mentioned it earlier, civil society in asking for a better criminal justice system. We certainly know that our criminal justice system is not going to be the solution to all our corruption problems. So what do you see the role of civil society being? And certainly, do you think we have a role in terms of prevention, the prevention and early intervention in corruption? So could you just speak to that point?
So I think on its face, civil society has a very important role to play. That's partly because of South Africa's history. Civil society has always been vigorous and strong and outspoken on a whole range of issues. But certainly also on the issue of corruption and criminal justice reform. There's always been vigorous civil society engagement on that issue, either as acting as watchdogs and making sure that government and the state is held to account, or also collaborating with government and criminal justice agencies, supporting through research, technical assistance, and other policy developments. So it's played a very nuanced and sophisticated role. And I would say its function stretches across the criminal justice chain, as it were, starting at prevention, certainly. Civil society writ large, if one were to include the media as well, has an important role to uncovering tendencies in respect of individuals or corporations who might engage in corrupt behavior. alerting the public, as it were, and policymakers as well. But it also has important roles through research, through monitoring, through network building, in supporting those policymakers who are serious about fighting the long-term fight to shift back the damage that has been done under state capture and push South Africa onto a new path with ethically compliant and vigorous and effective criminal justice institutions. But in South Africa, because civil society is as effective as it is, it even has a role to play in actual implementation of what are otherwise fairly traditional criminal justice functions. So the NPA, for example, it's got an initiative, the Community Prosecution Initiative, where prosecutors at the local level try to engage with community leaders, community organizations, to better understand the crime dynamics there, to then prioritize the right cases to focus on.
Right.
And that requires a lot of collaboration from civil society in feeding insights, information to the prosecution, collaborating with the prosecution, crime prevention initiatives, working with local governments, making sure street lights are fixed as a crime prevention mechanism, and so forth. And then, of course, civil society is also very effective because it often has international connections to learn from a lot of international experiences and good practices about what kinds of policies might be adaptable to the South African context to further enrich the sort of choice of options that are available to policymakers to make the justice system more effective in this country.
Thank you, Martin. A fascinating conversation. Thanks for taking the time to spend with us.